My name is Alex Carter. What you're about to hear is not a story. It's not an elaborate hoax, not a trick of the imagination. It is my truth. I've tried to keep it buried, to lock it away where no one, not even I, could reach it. But it keeps coming back, clawing its way to the surface, refusing to let me forget. And now, as I sit here trembling, the shadows on the walls moving when they shouldn't, I know it's time to speak. You have to believe me, before it's too late. For most of my life, I was the kind of person who dismissed the unexplainable. Ghost stories, cryptid sightings, supernatural legends, they were entertaining, sure, but they belonged to someone else's reality, not mine. I built my world on logic and routine, anchored by the comfort of the predictable. A 9-to-5 job, weekend hikes, crossword puzzles with my morning coffee. Everything fit neatly into place, and I liked it that way. I grew up hearing the same stories as everyone else. In my small town, they were practically folklore. Among them was the legend of the Mothman, a towering figure with massive wings and eyes that glowed like embers. A harbinger of disaster, they said, always appearing before tragedy struck. Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The collapse of the Silver Bridge in the 60s. People claimed the Mothman's piercing gaze could twist your mind, make you question what was real. But to me, it was just a campfire tale. A story to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods at night. Even as a child, I laughed at those who took it seriously. I'd sit around the fire with my friends, listening as they whispered about glowing red eyes and wings that blotted out the moon. When it was my turn to share, I'd invent something even more absurd, leaning into the ridiculous until everyone was laughing. Fear, I thought, was something you could conquer with reason. If it couldn't be explained, it wasn't real. That confidence carried me into adulthood. I became the skeptic in every room, the one who rolled his eyes at ghost stories and alien abduction accounts. "You really believe that?" I'd say, shaking my head. I remember one particular argument with a close friend, Jamie. She was always drawn to the supernatural, collecting books on cryptids and haunting documentaries. One night, after a few drinks, she told me about a time she'd seen something in the woods, something she couldn't explain. I laughed too loudly and said, "Jamie, come on. It was probably a deer or maybe a shadow from the trees. Our brains love to fill in the blanks." She'd looked at me, hurt but determined, and said, "One day, Alex, you'll see. And when you do, I hope you remember this conversation." I didn't take her seriously. Not then. But now, her words echo in my mind, louder than I can bear. It started on a road trip. One of those impulsive decisions you make when life feels too heavy and you need to breathe. I wasn't looking for adventure, just escape. The kind of drive where you roll down the windows, let the air clear your thoughts, and take the long way home. That night, the road stretched out before me, empty and quiet, too quiet. The trees on either side seemed to lean closer with each passing mile, their branches forming an oppressive canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The only light came from my headlights, carving a narrow path through the darkness. I remember thinking how calm it was, how still. But underneath that calm was something else, an unease I couldn't place. The kind that sits at the edge of your awareness, subtle but insistent. The hum of the tires on the pavement became a rhythm, steady and soothing. I turned off the radio, craving silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It felt alive, pressing against me, growing heavier with every mile. I rolled down the window, hoping the cool air would shake the feeling. But it only made it worse. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the car, clinging to my skin. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape. Something standing at the edge of the road, half hidden by the shadows. I slowed the car, squinting, my breath catching in my throat. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A deer, maybe. Or a large bird perched awkwardly on a branch. But as my headlights swept over it, the shape resolved into something that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were long and spindly, almost grotesque. Its posture was hunched, its form shrouded in darkness that seemed to absorb the light. But it was the eyes that stopped me cold. Two glowing red orbs, burning like coals, staring back at me with an intensity that pierced straight into my soul. They didn't reflect the light. They emanated it, an unnatural glow that seemed alive. I froze. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. My breath hitched, shallow and uneven. Time slowed, stretching unbearably, as the world narrowed to just me and those eyes. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to flee, but I couldn't. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by a fear I didn't understand. And then it moved. Its wings unfolded with a sound I can still hear, even now. A low, guttural rush, like the air itself recoiling in its presence. They were massive, stretching wider than the road, jagged and unnatural. Shadows seemed to ripple around them, distorting the light. The creature took a step forward, and the air grew thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, to turn the car around and race away, but I couldn't move. It was as if those eyes held me captive, drawing me deeper into their depths. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it was gone. One moment it was there, looming and suffocating. The next, the road was empty, the shadows still. I sat there for what felt like hours, the car idling in the middle of the road, my body trembling. When I finally forced myself to move, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I drove without thinking, without seeing, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had I just witnessed? Could it have been real? When I reached home, I locked the doors, turned on every light, and sat in the middle of my living room, trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. Exhaustion, stress, a trick of the light, anything but the truth. But deep down, I knew. I'd seen it. The Mothman. And once you see it, it never lets you go. That night, sleep was a distant dream. Every creak of the house, every flicker of shadow felt like a threat. I told myself it was over, that it was just one strange, unexplainable moment. But the fear clung to me, heavy and unrelenting. And as I sit here now, recounting it all, I realize that night was just the beginning. The first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. And the start of a nightmare I'm not sure I'll ever wake up from. The drive away from the creature felt endless. My hands shook so violently on the steering wheel that I feared I might veer off the road at any moment. The hum of the tires beneath me was no longer comforting. It became erratic, uneven, like a faint heartbeat that faltered with each passing second. The radio, which I hadn't touched, crackled with static, occasionally breaking into sharp, unintelligible bursts of sound. It was as though the air itself was alive, pressing in on the car, carrying whispers I couldn't quite hear but could feel crawling under my skin. I told myself to focus on the road, but my mind refused to comply. It kept replaying those glowing red eyes, burning into me with a malice I couldn't rationalize. Every time I blinked, I saw them. Every shadow that passed felt like it might stretch into a wing, or worse, the creature itself. My breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts, my chest tight with an unfamiliar dread. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the car door shut and ran up the steps, fumbling with my keys. Once inside, I bolted the door, something I'd never done before. The house felt different. It wasn't just the lingering fear. The air seemed heavier, charged with something unseen. I turned on every light, hoping to chase away the oppressive darkness. But even the light felt wrong, muted, as if struggling to push back against the shadows. The metallic smell hit me first, faint but distinct, like rusted iron or blood. It clung to the air no matter where I went. I checked the kitchen, the pipes, every possible source, but found nothing. The smell wasn't coming from anything physical. It was just there, surrounding me, inescapable. That night, I tried to sleep, but the house wouldn't let me. The usual creaks and groans of the old building felt louder, deliberate, as though something was moving just out of sight. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid with tension. Occasionally I thought I heard murmurs, faint and fleeting, coming from the walls or the floorboards. I convinced myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. In the morning, I tried to tell myself it was over. Whatever I had seen on the road was an anomaly, an illusion conjured by exhaustion or stress. But even in the daylight, the unease lingered. The metallic smell hadn't faded. The lights flickered occasionally, without explanation. Shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, moving when nothing else did. I laughed at myself, a hollow, unconvincing sound, as I tried to push the fear aside. When my phone buzzed later that day, I almost jumped out of my skin. The screen showed a message, but it was blank. Just a white box with no sender, no text, nothing. I stared at it, my pulse racing, before the phone suddenly restarted itself. I told myself it was a glitch, but the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing moment. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to clear my head, to get out of the house and distract myself. A hike in the nearby woods felt like the perfect escape. The fresh air, the familiar trails, it would ground me, remind me of what was real. At first, it worked. The woods were quiet, serene, the kind of calm that usually brought me peace. I focused on the crunch of leaves underfoot, the gentle sway of the trees above. But as I ventured deeper, that peace began to unravel. The stillness became oppressive, the air too quiet. Even the usual sounds of birds and insects were absent. It was the same silence I'd felt on the road that night, heavy and alive. I told myself to keep going, to push through the irrational fear, but the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. I stopped, turning slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. At first there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trunks and branches, their shadows forming dark, jagged patterns on the forest floor. But then I saw it, or at least I thought I did. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees, too fast to catch. My breath hitched as I turned in its direction, but it was gone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I forced myself to take a shaky step forward, then another, convinced that if I just kept moving, the fear would fade. It didn't. The flickers of movement became more frequent. A wing, a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. They appeared and vanished faster than I could process, but each one chipped away at my fragile composure. The air grew colder, sharper, as though it carried a warning I couldn't decipher. And then I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The creature stood between the trees, its form partially obscured but unmistakable. Its wings were folded against its back, jagged edges blending into the shadows. The red eyes glowed, brighter and more menacing than before. They locked onto me, and I felt the world tilt, my stomach churning violently. A wave of nausea rolled over me, my knees buckling as I tried to steady myself. I stumbled backward, breaking into a run without thinking. My feet pounded against the forest floor, my breath ragged and uneven. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind me, its presence a weight pressing down on me, suffocating and relentless. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and warping in my peripheral vision. My head throbbed, a sharp, searing pain that pulsed in time with my racing heart. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the open, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The nausea subsided slowly, but the pounding in my head remained, a cruel reminder of what I had seen. I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the forest, mocking me with its calm. I don't remember how I got home that day. The drive was a blur, my mind clouded by fear and confusion. When I stepped through the door, the metallic smell hit me again, stronger this time. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, more defined, as if they were watching me. I locked the door and sat in the middle of the living room, my knees drawn to my chest. The rational part of me was crumbling, overtaken by a fear I couldn't explain. I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't over. And for the first time, I realized I might never escape it. I didn't notice the symbols at first. They were faint, barely visible on the foggy surface of my bathroom mirror. At first glance, they looked like random smudges, the kind you'd expect after a hot shower. But as the days went on, they became sharper, more deliberate. Intersecting lines, jagged curves, patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I'd wiped them away, only to find them etched into the wood of my desk, scratched faintly into the plaster of my bedroom wall. They followed me everywhere, an unspoken language I couldn't escape. The whispers began soon after, soft at first, like a breeze brushing past my ear. They came at night, threading through the silence as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A single syllable here, a faint murmur there. I'd strained to listen, convinced it was just the house settling, the pipes groaning. But they grew louder, more distinct, taking on a form I couldn't ignore. My name, drawn out and guttural, echoed through the room, followed by disjointed fragments of sentences that made no sense but sent chills through me all the same. You can't hide. It sees you. It knows. The whispers carried an edge of familiarity, as if they weren't just voices but echoes of my own. They layered over each other, creating a cacophony of sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I'd cover my ears, press my face into my pillow, but nothing could drown them out. I stopped sleeping. The nights were too long, too heavy, filled with a dread that made closing my eyes feel like surrender. I'd sit at the edge of my bed, staring at the mirror on the dresser, daring it to betray me. And it did. One night, as I sat there, exhausted and shaking, I caught my reflection moving. It was subtle at first, a slight delay in the tilt of my head, the blink of my eyes. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the fog of sleeplessness clouding my mind. But then it smiled. I hadn't smiled. My lips were pressed into a tight line, trembling with the weight of my fear. But my reflection grinned back at me, slow and deliberate, its eyes glowing faintly red. I stumbled back, knocking over the lamp on my nightstand. When I looked again, the mirror was empty. Just my reflection, staring back as it should have been. But the grin lingered in my mind, a scar I couldn't erase. I covered the mirrors after that. Bedsheets, towels, anything I could find. I couldn't bear to see myself, or whatever it was that had taken my place. But covering the mirrors didn't stop the shadows. They began to move on their own, stretching across the walls, pooling in corners where no light could reach. At first they were fleeting, disappearing the moment I turned to look. But soon they lingered, their forms shifting, twisting into shapes that were almost human. Almost. I tried to reach out, desperate for some kind of anchor to reality. I called Jamie first, the friend who'd warned me long ago about things I couldn't explain. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm, concerned. I told her everything, the symbols, the whispers, the reflection. The words tumbled out in a frantic rush, each one more desperate than the last. There was a pause on the other end, long enough for doubt to creep in. "Alex," she said softly, "I think you need to talk to someone, a professional." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think I'm crazy?" "No," she said quickly. "I think you're scared, and I think whatever you're going through, you shouldn't have to face it alone." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Because even as she spoke, her voice began to distort, bending and warping into something unrecognizable. I pulled the phone away, staring at it in disbelief. Her words were still there, but layered over them was a guttural echo, mocking and cruel. And then it stopped. The line went dead. I called my parents next, hoping for reassurance, for some semblance of normalcy. My mother's voice was steady, her concern genuine, but when I tried to explain, she brushed it aside. "It's stress, Alex. You've always had an overactive imagination. Take a break. Get some rest." My father was less gentle. "You're scaring your mother with this nonsense. Pull yourself together." The calls left me more isolated than before. Each conversation felt like a chasm opening wider between me and the people I'd once trusted. I stopped trying. It was easier to let the silence grow, to retreat into myself. But the silence didn't last. The whispers evolved, shifting from disjointed murmurs to full voices, clear and cutting. They knew things about me, secrets I'd buried, fears I'd never spoken aloud. They taunted me with my own regrets, my failures, my doubts. "You'll never escape. This is who you are. It's already inside you." The voices overlapped, layering into a symphony of torment. Some spoke with my voice, twisted and wrong, while others were deeper, guttural, inhuman. They filled every corner of the room, suffocating me, leaving no space for thought or reason. And then, just as suddenly as they came, they'd stop, plunging the room into a silence that was almost worse. The physical toll was undeniable. I caught glimpses of myself in reflective surfaces, the sheen of a window, the gloss of a picture frame, and barely recognized the face staring back. My skin was pale, my eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. My clothes hung loosely on my frame, the result of days without eating, without sleeping. My hands trembled constantly, an outward sign of the chaos inside me. The shadows became bolder, moving in ways that defied logic. They didn't just stretch and shift, they reached. I'd see them curling along the edges of the room, creeping closer when I wasn't looking. Once, I felt one brush against my arm, cold and intangible, but real enough to make me jump. I turned on every light in the house, hoping to banish them, but they thrived in the brightness, their forms more defined than ever. The symbols, those damn symbols, spread like a virus. They were everywhere now, carved into the walls, the floorboards, even my skin. I'd wake up with fresh marks etched into my arms, thin and precise, as if done with a blade. I stopped looking at them, stopped trying to understand. They were a part of me now, whether I wanted them to be or not. I knew I was losing myself. My thoughts felt disjointed, fragmented, as if they didn't belong to me anymore. The world outside faded into the background, irrelevant and unreachable. My home became a prison, each room filled with reminders of the thing that haunted me. And through it all, those red eyes lingered at the edges of my mind, burning with a malice that refused to be forgotten. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The whispers are louder now, constant and insistent, never giving me a moment's peace. The shadows are closer, more defined, their movements deliberate and predatory. My reflection's eyes glow red more often than not, a fleeting but unmistakable reminder that I am no longer alone. The Mothman doesn't just haunt, it invades, it consumes, and I fear it's only a matter of time before there's nothing left of me at all. The whispers left no room for doubt. The Mothman wasn't just a fleeting nightmare or a trick of the mind. It was real, and it had marked me. Desperation drove me to seek answers. I needed to understand what was happening to me, why it had chosen me, and what it wanted. My search began online, a late-night descent into the darkest corners of the internet. At first, the results were predictable. Forum threads debating the Mothman's existence, photoshopped images, and recycled urban legends. But as I dug deeper, the tone changed. I found cryptic posts buried in forgotten forums, written by people who spoke not of sightings but of experiences. Their descriptions mirrored mine, the glowing eyes, the shadows, the whispers. They spoke of symbols etched into walls and the suffocating sense of being watched. One post in particular stood out. The words were hurried, fragmented, as if written in a panic. "Once it sees you," it read, "it's already too late. It gets inside your mind, twists everything. You can't escape it." At the bottom was a single line, "Contact me if you've seen it." Beneath it was an email address, signed simply, Nathan. I hesitated, staring at the screen. Reaching out felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But what choice did I have? My hands trembled as I typed out a message, detailing everything I had experienced. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The reply came within an hour. "I know what you're going through. Meet me, but once you start down this road, there's no turning back." Attached was an address in a small town a few hours away. The words filled me with equal parts dread and hope. If Nathan knew something, anything, it might be the only way to stop this. The drive to Nathan's house was uneventful but oppressive. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, as though the road itself was warning me to turn back. His house was isolated, set apart from the rest of the town. The windows were covered with heavy curtains and the yard was overgrown, a tangle of weeds and forgotten debris. A sign on the door read, "No visitors." I knocked anyway. Nathan opened the door almost immediately, as though he'd been standing just behind it, waiting. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, but his face was hollow, his eyes sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. Without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for me to enter. The inside of his house was worse than the outside. Every surface was covered in scribbled notes, books stacked precariously high, and symbols that looked disturbingly familiar. Candles burned in clusters on the floor, their flames flickering unnaturally. Nathan gestured for me to sit, clearing a space on a couch buried beneath papers. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat dry. "I need to know what it is, why it's following me." He sank into a chair across from me, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every action carried unbearable weight. "It's not following you," he said. "It's inside you now. That's how it works." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, inside me?" Nathan's gaze was steady, but his hands trembled as he picked up a notebook from the table beside him. He flipped through pages filled with frantic, uneven handwriting and handed it to me. "It doesn't just haunt. It invades. It feeds on fear, on vulnerability. The more you let it in, the stronger it gets." I scanned the pages, my stomach turning. They were filled with diagrams, symbols, and fragmented sentences. "It knows your regrets. It twists reality. Once you see it, you're marked." One phrase was underlined multiple times. "It's not a creature. It's a force." "How do I stop it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Nathan's expression darkened. You don't. You survive it, if you're strong enough. He began to tell me his story, his voice low and fractured. He had first seen the Mothman years ago on a deserted stretch of highway. The experience mirrored my own, down to the glowing eyes and the oppressive fear. But his torment hadn't stopped there. He described the same whispers, the same symbols, the same shadows that seemed to move on their own. It took everything from me, he said. My friends, my family, they thought I was crazy. Maybe I am. But that doesn't mean it's not real. He gestured around the room. I've been trying to understand it, to find a way to fight it. But the more I learn, the more it takes. It doesn't want you to understand. It wants you to break. I left Nathan's house with more questions than answers. His final words stayed with me as I drove home. It's not done with you, and it never will be. When I arrived, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The air inside the house was stifling, thick with the metallic smell that had become all too familiar. The lights flickered as I stepped through the door, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift on their own. My living room was unrecognizable. The notes I had been compiling were shredded, scattered across the floor like confetti. Symbols were gouged deep into the walls, their jagged lines radiating a malevolent energy. Objects I hadn't touched in weeks were rearranged into patterns that felt deliberate, ritualistic. In the center of it all was a single sheet of paper, untouched, placed deliberately. The words on it sent a chill through me, so profound I thought I might collapse. It's not over. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent than ever. They didn't just call my name. They mocked me, taunted me with everything I feared. The shadows crept closer, their movements no longer subtle. My reflection in the darkened windows wasn't my own. It smiled at me with glowing red eyes, a cruel and knowing grin. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The Mothman isn't just haunting me. It's inside me, twisting everything I am, everything I know. And it's not over. It will never be over. I woke up in the woods, face down in the dirt, the taste of soil sharp on my tongue. My clothes were damp with dew, my hands scratched and raw. I didn't know how I had gotten there. The last thing I remembered was sitting at my desk, staring at the shredded remnants of my notes. Now I was surrounded by towering trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The ground around me was marked with symbols, crudely etched into the earth. I recognized them immediately. They were the same ones that had appeared on my walls, on my mirrors, and now on my skin. Thin, precise lines covered my arms, carved in a language I didn't understand. The blackouts became more frequent after that. I'd wake up in places I couldn't explain. The middle of a highway, my car parked haphazardly on the shoulder, or curled up in the bathtub, the water ice cold and tinged with a faint metallic smell. Each time, my body bore new marks. The symbols grew more intricate, more deliberate, as though someone or something was using me as a canvas. My head throbbed constantly, the pain sharp and relentless, as though something was clawing its way out from the inside. My vision blurred unpredictably, shadows creeping into the edges of my sight. Occasionally, I'd lose all sense of time. Minutes felt like hours, and hours vanished in an instant. The nausea was the worst, a churning in my stomach that never seemed to leave. The metallic taste that lingered in my mouth was almost unbearable, as though I was swallowing fear itself. It wasn't long before I started hearing the voice. It wasn't like the whispers. Those were external, haunting the edges of my perception. This voice was inside me, low and guttural, vibrating through my skull. It spoke in fragmented sentences, disjointed and otherworldly. You belong to me. There is no escape. You are mine. The voice carried a weight that made my body tremble, my chest tight with an oppressive pressure I couldn't shake. It felt as though the words were being etched into my very being, leaving behind invisible scars that burned and throbbed with every syllable. And then it appeared, the Mothman. Not in fleeting glimpses or distorted reflections, but fully and undeniably present. It emerged from the shadows of my living room, its form shifting and unstable. One moment, it was humanoid, towering and angular, its wings folded like jagged curtains of darkness. The next, it was an amorphous void, swirling with a darkness so deep it seemed to devour the light around it. The red eyes burned constant, unchanging, anchoring me to its presence. I couldn't move. The air around me was heavy, charged with a static that made my skin crawl. The voice echoed in my mind, layering over itself in a chorus of torment. You cannot fight me. I am inside you. Surrender. My head felt like it might split open. The pain was blinding, my vision fracturing into shards of light and shadow. Colors bled into each other, and for a horrifying moment I could taste the crimson glow of its eyes, bitter, metallic, and overwhelming. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The Mothman didn't move, but its presence filled the room, pressing against the walls, the ceiling, the very fabric of reality. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore through the oppressive silence. And then everything changed. The furniture around me began to levitate, rising slowly at first, then violently jerking as though caught in an invisible storm. The whispers returned, deafening now, a cacophony of voices that overlapped and distorted, each one more grotesque than the last. My own voice joined them, echoing back at me, warped and cruel. You can't run. It's too late. You are mine. I tried to fight back, to push against the overwhelming force that had taken over my home, my mind, my body, but it was futile. The Mothman stepped closer, its form shifting again, becoming more solid, more real. Its wings unfurled, stretching wide, their jagged edges slicing through the air. The glow of its eyes intensified, bathing the room in an eerie red light. And then it spoke, not in whispers, not in echoes, but directly to me. The voice was layered, 100 tones woven together into a single resonant command. You will break. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving me to my knees. The room spun around me, the walls bending and warping as though reality itself was unraveling. The symbols on my skin burned, the pain searing and relentless. I clawed at my arms, desperate to erase them, but they only grew darker, more defined. In a final act of defiance, I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking under the weight of the Mothman's presence. What do you want from me? I shouted, my voice cracking. Why me? The creature tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt mocking. You invited me, it said. Your fear is my refuge, your pain my sustenance. You are mine, Alex, you always were. The realization hit me with a clarity that left me breathless. This wasn't just about what I had seen or experienced. The Mothman hadn't chosen me at random. It had been waiting, watching, feeding on every doubt, every regret, every moment of weakness. It had woven itself into my life, my mind, my very soul. The room exploded into chaos. The furniture crashed to the ground, the lights shattered, plunging everything into darkness. The whispers rose to a crescendo, then stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt deafening. When I opened my eyes, the Mothman was gone. I was alone. The house was in ruins, the walls scarred with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. My body ached, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and fear. But the worst pain was inside me, a hollow, gnawing emptiness where something vital had been taken. I knew it wasn't over. The Mothman wasn't finished with me. It had retreated, but its presence lingered, a shadow that would never fully disappear. I could feel it, watching, waiting, biding its time. And I knew deep down that no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to rebuild, it would always find me. Because it wasn't just haunting me, it was part of me now. I left the house the next morning, or at least what was left of it. The walls were scarred with symbols, the furniture overturned and broken, the air still heavy with the metallic scent that clung to my skin no matter how many times I tried to wash it away. I didn't look back as I drove away. I couldn't. The fear had rooted itself too deeply in me, and I knew that no amount of distance could truly escape it. I found a small apartment on the edge of town, a plain, unassuming place where I hoped I could start over. The kind of place where no one asks questions, and you're just another name on a mailbox. At first, I tried to convince myself that this was a new beginning, that I could leave the past behind me, that the Mothman, or whatever it was tied to the house, not to me. But it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. The first night, I caught a faint glow in the corner of the room, a soft, greenish hue that pulsed faintly against the darkness. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the street lamp outside. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. Just the corner, empty and dark. The glow persisted, faint and mocking, as if daring me to acknowledge it. Mirrors became my greatest enemy. I'd avoided them since that night in my old house, but it was impossible to escape reflections entirely. The glass on picture frames, the sheen of a faucet, even the surface of a spoon could catch my face, distorted and wrong. Sometimes my reflection moved when I didn't, its eyes lingering too long, or its expression twisting into a mockery of my own. I started covering every reflective surface in the apartment, draping them with towels or turning them to the wall. But no matter how many I hid, I could still feel them watching me. I stopped going out at night. The shadows were too long, too alive, stretching and shifting in ways they shouldn't. Even during the day, I avoided crowds, unwilling to risk the brief flashes of glowing red eyes that I sometimes saw in the faces of strangers. It didn't matter if it was real or imagined. The fear was the same. The whispers never left. They weren't as loud as they had been in the house, but they were always there, threading through the silence like a faint hum just below the edge of hearing. They called my name sometimes, soft and insistent, or spoke in fragments of sentences that made no sense but left me trembling all the same. I'd wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I'd heard someone, something, breathing just beyond the edge of the bed. The symbols followed me too. I'd catch myself drawing them without realizing it, my fingers tracing the shapes into the condensation on a window, or scratching them into the wood of my desk with the edge of a pen. They appeared in my dreams, glowing and pulsating, burning themselves into my mind. Sometimes I'd wake to find them etched into my skin, faint but unmistakable, as though my body had become a canvas for something I couldn't control. I stopped answering phone calls, stopped responding to messages. Every conversation felt distant, as though the words were coming from underwater. People tried to reach out at first, their voices filled with concern, but I pushed them away. How could I explain what was happening to me? How could I tell them that the Mothman wasn't just a creature, but a force that had embedded itself into my very existence? It was easier to let the silence grow, to retreat into the isolation that had become my only refuge. Even in my solitude, the fear found ways to consume me. I'd sit in the living room, the curtains drawn, the lights on, and still feel the weight of its gaze. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, shifting slightly when I wasn't looking. The air was heavy, charged, like the moments before a storm. I'd catch myself holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, even though I knew it wouldn't. Not yet. The metallic taste was the worst. It came without warning, filling my mouth with a sharp, bitter tang of fear. It didn't matter what I ate or drank. The taste lingered, a constant reminder of the presence I could never escape. I'd brush my teeth until my gums bled, trying to rid myself of it, but it always came back, stronger than before. I tried to distract myself, to fill the hours with meaningless tasks. I cleaned the apartment obsessively, scrubbing every surface until my hands were raw. I rearranged furniture, alphabetized books, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, the fear seeped into every corner of my life, staining it like an ink blot that couldn't be erased. The symbols began to appear outside the apartment. I'd see them carved into the bark of trees on my morning walk, or etched into the concrete of a sidewalk. Once, I found them scrawled in chalk on the wall of a nearby alley, their lines precise and deliberate. I stopped walking after that, stopped leaving the apartment altogether. The outside world felt too vast, too dangerous, filled with reminders that the Mothman's reach extended far beyond my understanding. I wish I could say that time dulled the fear, that I found a way to reclaim my life. But the truth is, the Mothman left a mark on me that will never fade. It's not just the symbols, or the whispers, or the shadows. It's the knowledge that it's still there, watching, waiting. It doesn't need to haunt me actively anymore. It's done its work. The fear is part of me now, as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. Some nights, I'll catch myself staring at the covered mirrors, tempted to pull the cloth away just to see if my reflection is still my own. Other nights, I'll hear a faint rustling in the corner of the room, and I'll turn my head, expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring back at me. They never are. But that's almost worse. Because it means it's still waiting, biding its time, knowing that the fear it's planted will keep growing, feeding it even in its absence. I've stopped trying to fight it. There's no point. The Mothman isn't something you can defeat or escape. It's not just a creature, it's an idea, a force that thrives on fear and despair. And once it's seen you, once it's marked you, it never really leaves. It becomes a part of you, a shadow that stretches too long, a whisper that lingers in the silence, a taste that never fades. I don't know how long I can keep going like this. The days blur together, each one heavier than the last. But I've learned to live with the fear, to carry it with me like a second skin. It's not a life I would have chosen, but it's the one I have now. And so I keep moving, one step at a time, because stopping would mean surrendering completely. If you're listening to this, if you've seen it, felt it, you'll understand. And if you haven't, I hope you never do. Because once the Mothman marks you, it's not over. It's never over. Fear is a strange thing. It isn't just a reaction to danger or the unknown. It's a mirror, reflecting back everything you try to bury. Your doubts, your regrets, the things you're too afraid to admit even to yourself. I used to think of fear as something external, something you could avoid or conquer. But now I understand. Fear doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within. The Mothman didn't create my fear. It didn't summon some foreign terror to haunt me. What it did was far worse. It reached inside me, pulled apart my defenses, and exposed every crack, every flaw, every hidden insecurity. It took my fears and made them real. And in doing so, it showed me just how fragile I really am. I've spent countless nights replaying everything in my mind, trying to understand why this happened to me, why I saw it, why it chose me. The truth is, I don't know. Maybe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe it saw something in me that I refused to see in myself. Weakness, vulnerability, an open door. Whatever the reason, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it's here. And once it's here, it never leaves. I've come to realize that the Mothman isn't just a creature. It's not just a legend, some cryptid that lurks in the shadows. It's something more, something that exists beyond the boundaries of what we can understand. It doesn't just haunt you. It becomes a part of you. It doesn't attack you. It doesn't need to. It lets you unravel yourself. It plants a seed of fear and watches as you feed it, nurture it, until it consumes everything you are. It's easy to blame the Mothman for what's happened to me, to say that it's the reason my life has fallen apart. But the truth is harder to face. The Mothman didn't destroy my life. It revealed the cracks that were already there. It held up a mirror and forced me to look at myself, to see the person I'd been hiding from. And what I saw terrified me more than anything else. I used to laugh at fear. I used to think I was untouchable, that nothing could shake me. Now I know better. Fear isn't something you can dismiss with logic or reason. It's not something you can fight, because fear isn't out there waiting to pounce. It's inside you, a part of you. And when something like the Mothman comes along, it doesn't bring fear with it. It just unlocks the door. If you're listening to this, I need you to understand. This isn't just my story. It's not some isolated incident, some unlucky twist of fate. The Mothman is real. And it's not just watching from the shadows. It's waiting. Waiting for the moment when you're most vulnerable, when the cracks in your armor are wide enough for it to slip through. And once it does, there's no going back. You might think you're safe, that it won't happen to you, that you're stronger, braver, smarter. I used to think that too. But fear doesn't care how strong you are. It doesn't care how brave you are. It finds a way in, no matter how tightly you try to seal the door. And once it's inside, it's already too late. Be vigilant. Pay attention to the shadows, to the whispers that linger at the edge of your hearing. Don't dismiss the things you can't explain. Don't ignore the unease that settles in your chest for no reason, because that's how it starts. A flicker of doubt. A faint chill. A single moment where reality feels just slightly off. That's all it needs. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you this because I need you to be ready. If it comes for you, if you see it, if you feel it, don't try to fight it. Don't try to run. You can't. All you can do is hold on to who you are for as long as you can. Don't let it take everything. Don't let it turn you into what it wants you to be. Even now, as I sit here, I can feel it watching me. The room is quiet, the lights are on, but the shadows feel heavier, closer. The whispers are faint, almost imperceptible, but they're there, threading through the silence like a distant echo. I know it's not over. It's never over. The Mothman doesn't leave. It lingers, just out of sight, just beyond the edges of understanding. waiting for the moment when I'm too tired to fight. I don't know how much longer I have. But if this is the last thing I ever say, let it be this. Be careful, be vigilant, and whatever you do, don't look too closely, because once you see it, once it knows you're there, it never lets go. Even now, it's watching.